when 4 men from the Aldgate convoy surrounded a lean, scarred Belgian Malinois chained to a government-plated pickup outside the high desert fuel and feed in Copper Basin, Wyoming. They were certain they were looking at somebody's forgotten dog. A young wildlife enforcement officer crossing the gravel lot tried to warn them back, but the crew chief only laughed. Then the youngest Aldgate son reached for the dog's tactical harness, and a quiet man in a worn federal windbreaker stepped out from behind the diesel pumps, and nothing about that February morning in Carbon County stayed the same. The cold off the Great Divide Basin did not ease into Carbon County. It arrived like a debt collector, blunt, unannounced, and completely indifferent to whoever was in its path. At the high desert fuel and feed-off Highway 287, where the sagebrush plains stretched flat and colorless toward the distant outline of the Wind River Range, the temperature had not climbed above 12 degrees since sunup. Dust devils spun tight along the gravel margins of the truck lot. A row of 18-wheelers idled in a line, exhaling white columns of diesel smoke into a bone-white sky. Senna Vail pulled her Wyoming game and fish department truck into the far end of the lot just after 7:15 in the morning, tires crunching over a skin of black ice at the lot's edge. She was 29 years old, with dark hair pulled back tight under a gray wool cap, a lean face weathered from years working high-elevation terrain, and the kind of still, attentive eyes that only come from spending a long time in places where missing a detail gets someone killed. She had spent 4 years as an Army K-9 handler attached to a military working dog unit at Fort Campbell before a lateral femoral fracture from a vehicle rollover in Kandahar ended her forward deployment. The Army let her finish her contract stateside, training new handler teams. Then she came home to Wyoming and found the closest thing she could to the work she actually understood. She was supposed to stop here for coffee and a tire pressure check before driving another hour north to a poaching call near the Seminole Reservoir. She had 17 minutes before she needed to be back on the road. She stepped out of the truck and immediately noticed the vehicle parked near the propane cage on the building's south wall. It was a late-model government-issued Ford F-250 with federal plates, partially obscured by an Aldgate mineral and transport flatbed that had pulled in too close on the left side. Chained to the F-250's rear tow hook by a heavy-duty nylon runner was a dog. Senna stopped walking. The animal was a Belgian Malinois, compact, close-coated, fawn and black, with a muzzle that had been broken at some point and heeled slightly off-center, giving him a look of chronic, dignified suspicion. He was not barking, he was not pacing. He sat absolutely motionless in the frozen gravel, his weight balanced evenly on all 4 paws, amber eyes tracking 4 men who were walking toward him from the direction of the Aldgate flatbed with the easy confidence of people who had never been seriously corrected by anything. The dog wore a dark green tactical harness, stripped of insignia, with a single rectangle of empty black Velcro on the left shoulder panel where a unit patch had once been mounted. His left ear carried a blue tattoo. Senna was still 40 feet away, but she had read enough of those numbers in her life to know exactly what they meant. Curtis Aldgate was in his early 60s, broad through the chest and jaw, with the face of a man who had spent decades converting every room he entered into a room he owned. He ran Aldgate Mineral and Transport, the largest private mineral extraction company in Carbon County, with contracts touching half the state legislature and a reputation for making inconvenient problems quietly disappear. Walking beside him was his son, Trace Aldgate, 23 years old, and constructed entirely out of borrowed authority, a silver championship buckle on his belt, and an absolute inability to read a room. Flanking them were Roy Pickens, the company's senior equipment supervisor, a stocky, close-mouthed man with a folding knife clipped to his front pocket, and a younger driver named Will Sauer, who mostly did what he was told and looked away when he shouldn't. Trace was already grinning. "Look at this thing," he said, stopping 5 feet from the dog and resting his hands on his hips. Federal plates on the truck, government dog sitting in the dirt. Somebody forgot their lunch. Roy Pickens circled the F-250 slowly, hands in his coat pockets, eyes moving across the rear cargo bed. Harness like that costs real money, he said. Dog like that's worth something. Working lines. If somebody wanted him, they wouldn't have left him tied to a hitch in a truck stop lot, Trace said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a gas station jerky strip, peeling the wrapper with his teeth. He held it out toward the dog. The Malinois did not move. His amber eyes did not leave Trace's hands. Step back from the dog. The voice was clear, direct, and not particularly loud. Senna had crossed the lot at a controlled walk. Running around a working dog in high alert mode is how people lose their faces. And she now stood 15 feet from the Aldgate group, right hand resting open at her side, body angled slightly out of reflex. Curtis Aldgate turned. He looked at the Wyoming game and fish badge on her chest, then at her face, and his expression moved from mild annoyance to contemptuous amusement in the time it takes a man like him to conclude that whoever is standing in front of him simply doesn't matter. "This is a public fuel stop," Curtis said pleasantly. "That dog has been sitting out here unattended for 20-some minutes. We were just checking on it." "With respect, sir, you weren't checking on it," Senna said evenly. "Your son was attempting to feed it. That's a different thing. Step back from the harness." Trace laughed, a short, sharp sound designed to communicate indifference. "Game warden's gonna tell me I can't give a dog a treat. You hear that, Roy? I'm being formally warned about beef jerky." He turned back to the Malinois and held the jerky strip lower. The dog's nostrils flared once precisely, and his eyes returned to Trace's hands without any expression at all. "I'm a licensed wildlife enforcement officer and a former Army K-9 handler," Senna said, keeping her voice level. "That tattoo in his left ear is a federal military working dog registry mark. This animal is not abandoned and he is not a pet. You reach for that harness and he will put you on the ground." Curtis Aldgate stepped forward, closing the distance with the unhurried ease of a man who had always found that physical proximity ended most arguments in his favor. He was a full head taller than Senna and outweighed her by 90 pounds. "Young lady, I have 3 state legislators who return my calls personally, and I have never once taken direction from a fish cop," he said. "Trace, get a lead rope from the flatbed. We'll put the dog in the back cab until animal control comes out." "Mr. Aldgate, we're done talking." Trace jogged back to the Aldgate flatbed and returned with a thick nylon lead looped over his forearm, grinning like a man about to win a bet. Roy Pickens had drifted silently to the dog's left flank. Will Sauer hung back near the bumper, studying his boots. Senna stepped forward and raised her voice. "Trace, do not touch that harness." Trace Aldgate laughed one more time. Then he reached down and closed his right hand over the handle loop on top of the dog's tactical harness. The dog's name was Flint. His registry number was K748831. He had served 6 years with U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Tactical Terrorism Response Team, specializing in detection of commercial-grade detonators, improvised explosive components, and military specification propellants. He had been deployed 14 times to active interdiction sectors. He had been injured twice, once by a boot kick that fractured 2 left ribs, and once by fragmented glass from a vehicle ramming that left a crescent scar along his right shoulder. He had never, in 6 years of operational service, failed a confirmed scent. He was not a pet, he was not confused, and he had absolutely no interest in the beef jerky. The moment Trace's hand gripped the harness handle, Flint moved. There was no bark. There was no warning growl. There was only the sudden, total conversion of a motionless animal into a 47-pound projectile that had spent the last 9 minutes calculating distances with the calm patience of something trained to be very good at waiting. Flint pivoted on his haunches, the nylon runner snapping taut with a sound like a cracked whip, and drove his jaws into Trace Aldgate's right forearm with every ounce of his considerable drive. He didn't slash, didn't shake. He bit down with controlled, crushing precision. The specific hold taught to working dogs to immobilize a limb without severing the artery, and drove his body weight into Trace's chest. Trace Aldgate went down in the gravel like a man who had never considered, until this precise moment, that the ground could happen to him that fast. The lead rope flew from his hand. His Stetson cartwheeled sideways. He hit the frozen gravel and let out a sound that bore no resemblance to the easy laugh he had been producing for the last 4 minutes, a raw, high sound of pure shock and pain. Flint held the grip. He planted 2 compact, mud-caked paws on Trace's sternum and lowered his scarred muzzle to within 6 inches of Trace's face. The vibration coming from his chest was not quite a growl and not quite a sound, more like a frequency that registered in the spine before it reached the ears. "Get him off!" Trace screamed, thrashing in the gravel. "Get him off my arm! He's crushing it! Get him off!" Roy Pickens did not reach for the dog. He reached for his knife. Curtis Aldgate's hand dropped to the holster on his right hip, a Ruger .357 Magnum, carried openly, apparently without anyone ever having sat him down to discuss the full range of consequences that come with drawing one. He had it up and leveled at the dog's head before Senna had taken 2 steps forward. "I will shoot that animal," Curtis said. His voice had lost all its pleasantness. What was underneath was not panic. It was something colder. The specific fury of a man who has been made to look helpless in a public parking lot. "Get that dog off my son right now." Senna stopped. She was 12 feet from Curtis's gun barrel and 20 feet from Flint. She kept her hands visible. "Curtis, if you fire that weapon, you will hit your son," she said. "Flint is directly on top of him. Your bullet goes through the dog and into Trace. Think." "Don't say another word to me." Curtis kept the gun up. Beside him, Roy had his knife open, edging left. The voice that stopped everything was not loud. It was quiet in the way that a room goes quiet when a door opens onto something much larger than the room itself. Niederlegen aus. 2 commands, German, spoken in a low, even baritone from the corner of the building, from behind the propane storage cage, where the fuel stop service alley ran along the south wall. Flint released Trace's arm. He backed up 2 measured steps, dropped into a sit, straightened his spine, and fixed his amber eyes on the man walking out of the service alley with the focused, clean attention of a soldier receiving his commanding officer. Trace Aldgate lay in the gravel, clutching his forearm, his face chalk-white, his eyes glassy. The man who had spoken crossed the lot without hurrying. He was broad through the shoulders and moved with the low-center, conserved momentum stride of someone who had spent a long time in places where energy was a resource you did not waste. He wore a worn canvas Federal windbreaker over a dark thermal base layer, scuffed Bates boots, and a grey wool watch cap. On his left hip, half visible beneath the windbreaker, was a badge carrier, heavy brass, Federal crest, the kind that was not issued to anyone whose authority could be argued with. On his right cheekbone was a pale, thin scar that curved along the bone like a parenthesis. His name was Rafe Deering. He was 38 years old and had spent 11 years as a Marine raider before transitioning to investigative work with the USDA Office of Inspector General's Special Operations Division, a posting most people in Copper Basin had never heard of and would not have understood if explained to them. He did not acknowledge the gun. He walked past Senna, giving her a single fractional nod as he passed, the acknowledgement that moves between people who understand each other's training without discussion, and stopped 9 feet from the barrel of Curtis Aldgate's Ruger. "Lower the weapon," Rafe said. "I don't know you," Curtis said. His gun hand was steadier now, which was more dangerous, not less. "I don't know who you are. I don't know what federal department you think you work for, and I am standing on private commercial property with a man who just had his arm ripped open by your dog. You've got 10 seconds to explain yourself before. You're pointing a firearm at a federal agent and an active federal detection K9 in a documented operational theater, Rafe said, in the same quiet register he'd used since he appeared. That's a federal felony. You're also blocking a federal evidence site. That's a second one. Lower the gun. Evidence site, Roy Pickens repeated from behind, voice uncertain. What does that mean? Senna had pulled her phone and stepped back to the lot's edge. She was already on with Carbon County Dispatch. Higher, Rafe said, without looking at the dog. Flint stood, walked to Rafe's left side, and pressed his flank against the agent's leg, settling into a perfect heel. His amber eyes had not left Roy Pickens since Pickens opened the knife. Curtis Aldgate's jaw worked. The fury behind his eyes was real and hot, but it was fighting now with something else. The first cold draft of genuine uncertainty reaching a man who had not felt that particular sensation in a very long time. Flint has been sitting at the rear axle of your company's flatbed since 6:52 this morning, Rafe said conversationally. He alerted 7 minutes after your convoy arrived. I have the field report timestamp. He looked directly at Curtis. Do you want to tell me what's in the rear differential housing of that flatbed, or should I wait for the technical team? Curtis Aldgate said nothing. In 6 years of active deployment, this dog has never produced a false alert on commercial detonators, Rafe said. The word sat in the freezing air like something physical. Roy Pickens took one step backward. Your flatbed is carrying what our preliminary assessment indicates is approximately 60 units of stolen commercial blasting caps, federal procurement stock, removed from an authorized mining reserve in Fremont County 8 weeks ago, Rafe continued. The same reserve your subsidiary, Aldgate Site Development LLC, held a temporary access contract with until November. When that contract was terminated, a federal inventory team flagged a discrepancy. 60 units of PETN-based detonating assemblies, federal property. Curtis Aldgate lowered the gun. He didn't lower it out of cooperation. He lowered it because the arithmetic of what he was looking at had finally produced a number he could not talk his way past. My nephew manages site development, Curtis said. His voice had dropped an octave. I'm not personally involved in the procurement logistics. Denton Aldgate was arrested at the Rawlins Way station 40 minutes ago, Rafe said. He was watching Roy Pickens now, not Curtis. He provided a complete account, including the distribution arrangement with your Southern Transport Division. Curtis Aldgate went grey. 3 Carbon County Sheriff's vehicles and 2 unmarked federal SUVs appeared at the highway entrance to the lot, emergency lights running silent, spreading across the gravel in a practiced arc. Behind them came a panel van bearing the letters ATFE, the specialized technical team from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Field Office out of Casper. Sheriff Gwen Arlo stepped out of the lead cruiser. She was a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the demeanor of someone who had long ago decided that the most efficient response to most situations was simply to proceed. She walked directly to Curtis Aldgate, looked at the Ruger hanging in his lowered hand, and held out her palm. Curtis placed the gun in it without looking at her. Curtis Aldgate, Sheriff Arlo said, I've watched you run this county like a private holding for 30 years. Looks like today we're settling accounts. 2 federal medics crouched over Trace in the gravel, cutting away his jacket sleeve and wrapping a compression bandage around his forearm. The artery was intact. The radial nerve had been shocked, but not severed. He would have full use of the arm after several weeks of rehabilitation. He was, at that precise moment, crying quietly into the frozen gravel of the high desert fuel and feed parking lot, and every ounce of swagger he had walked in with that morning had evaporated completely. The technical team moved on the Aldgate flatbed with magnetic scanning equipment, and a second detection dog, a young German shepherd still learning the work. The young dog alerted within 90 seconds to the same location Flint had flagged. The rear differential housing had been modified, a custom cavity machined directly into the axle assembly, accessible only by removing a specific bolt pattern that looked, to a casual inspection, like standard maintenance hardware. Inside the cavity, 63 blasting cap assemblies, PETN-based, federal procurement batch coding matching the Fremont County Reserve inventory exactly. Roy Pickens had gone quiet through all of it, standing at the lot's edge near the flatbed, watching the federal team work and saying nothing. Senna had been watching him the way you watch a man who hasn't yet decided what he's going to do. She saw it before anyone else. Pickens's right hand moved to his jacket pocket. Not the knife pocket, the other one, and his eyes had stopped following the federal team and were now fixed on Kyle Ames, the 19-year-old fuel attendant who had stepped out of the service bay door to see what was happening and was now standing 15 feet away, holding a grease rag in both hands and staring at the federal badges with his mouth open. Roy, Senna said, already moving. Pickens covered the ground to Kyle Ames in 4 heavy steps, got an arm around the boy's throat, and dragged him backward against the metal service bay door. In his free hand, he now held a compact Taurus pistol, not the folding knife, pressed against the attendant's left temple. "Nobody move," Pickens said. His voice had stripped down to something flat and essential, the voice of a man who has just burned every bridge behind him and understands it clearly. "I mean everybody. Feds, sheriff, all of you. Nobody moves. I want the keys to the black Suburban and I want a clear lane to the highway now." The federal agents froze, the ATF techs froze. Sheriff Arlo raised a hand toward her deputies. Kyle Ames's face had gone the color of printer paper. The grease rag fell from his fingers. He made a sound that was not quite a word. Trace Aldgate watched from beside the sheriff's cruiser, apparently having concluded that Roy Pickens was now entirely someone else's problem. Rafe did not draw his weapon. He stood 12 feet from Pickens, hands open at his sides, and looked at Senna. Senna looked back. It was a brief look, the kind that functions as a complete conversation between two people who have both spent time in situations where the margin for error is measured in fractions of a second. She moved left toward the service bay corner, not rushing, not stopping, repositioning in a way that a desperate man with a gun and narrowed peripheral vision might not immediately register as intentional. "Roy," she said. She kept her voice calm, almost gentle. "Kyle has nothing to do with any of this. He came outside to check the lot. Let him go and we can talk about what your actual exposure looks like, separate from Curtis." "Shut up," Pickens said, but his eyes tracked to her, which meant they were no longer exclusively on Rafe. "You're looking at conspiracy right now," Senna said. "That's 10 years, maybe less with cooperation. You grab that boy, and it becomes something you never walk out of. Think about what you're doing." Pickens's gun hand was trembling, not from hesitation, from adrenaline, which was worse, because adrenaline makes people do the exact things they would not choose with a clear mind. "Fass," Rafe said, barely above a whisper, not directed at Pickens, not directed at the federal team. Flint came off his haunches like a piece of released spring tension. He went low, ground level inside the sightline shadow cast by the fuel pump housing, angling wide around the lot's perimeter rather than crossing it directly, using the geometry of the space the way he had been trained to use every space, without thought, without hesitation. Pickens was facing forward. His stress response had been running for 6 minutes, narrowing his field of attention to the people in front of him. He did not see the dog until the dog was already in the air. Flint's jaws clamped on Roy Pickens's right knee, the joint precisely, with the controlled accuracy that is the hallmark of elite working dogs trained in suspect apprehension. The impact took Pickens's leg out from under him completely. His arm released Kyle Ames as he went down. The Taurus fired once, into the gravel 6 feet from anyone, and then spun out of his hand as Flint held the grip, rotating Pickens's lower body and pinning him on his back to the frozen ground with the full weight of his drive and momentum behind it. Kyle Ames stumbled forward, and Senna caught him by the arm, pulling him around the corner of the service bay and behind the cover of a parked pickup. 4 federal agents swarmed Roy Pickens in under 3 seconds. Flint stepped back at a silent hand signal from Rafe, returning to heel with the unhurried precision of a dog who has done this before and knows that the work is finished. The parking lot of the high desert fuel and feed went quiet. Wind moved through the sagebrush at the lot's edge. Snow was beginning to come down from the west, soft, dry flakes settling on the gravel, on the dark shape of the Aldgate flatbed, on the fawn and black fur of the dog sitting perfectly still beside the man in the federal windbreaker. Sheriff Arlo supervised the loading of Curtis Aldgate, Trace Aldgate, Roy Pickens and Will Sauer into separate county vehicles. Trace had stopped crying. He sat in the back of a cruiser with a bandaged arm and the hollow, distant expression of someone whose understanding of how the world operates has been recently and comprehensively revised. Kyle Ames sat on the bumper of a federal SUV with a foil emergency blanket around his shoulders that he clearly didn't think he needed and clearly did. An ATF agent had found him a cup of coffee from inside the store, and he was holding it with both hands. Rafe crouched next to Flint, running both hands along the dog's sides, ears, gums, paws, the old scar tissue along his right shoulder. Flint accepted the inspection with dignified patience, then turned his head and pressed his muzzle briefly against Rafe's cheek. Senna walked over. She crouched on Flint's other side, extended the back of her hand the way you always do first, and waited. Flint looked up at Rafe. Something passed between them. Then the dog leaned forward and set his chin in Senna's open palm. Left hind is favoring, Senna said quietly. Old injury. Training accident during his 4th year, Rafe said. Hairline fracture of the calcaneus. Healed clean but tightens in the cold. He needs a vet to look at it, Senna said, and glucosamine if he's not already on it. He is. Rafe looked at her. You clocked the tattoo from 40 feet. I used to read those numbers every morning, Senna said. Fort Campbell. 341st Training Squadron, 4 years. Rafe nodded, not small talk, recognition. Special Agent in Charge Dana Reese from the USDA OIG Casper Field Office appeared at Rafe's shoulder, badge out of habit, breath making a small cloud in the freezing air. She was a lean, precise woman in her 40s who gave the impression of someone who had long since stopped being interested in explanations and was only interested in what could be documented. K-74 8831's alert was the clean evidentiary link we needed, she said to Rafe. Technical team confirmed the blasting caps matched the Fremont County serial batch, 63 units. We also found detonation cord in the cab's secondary floor panel. The Rawlins intercept team pulled a complete manifest from Denton Aldgate's phone. Names, drop coordinates, payment routing. She paused. This goes further than the Aldgate family. There is a buyer network. The militia operating out of the Owl Creek Mountains, Rafe said. Not a question. We've been building toward this for 7 months, Reese said. The dog's alert this morning closed the last gap we needed for the warrant. She glanced at Flint, then back at Rafe. He didn't miss. No, Rafe agreed, he never does. Senna looked between them. Has he been cleared to continue active service? Formally, yes, Rafe said, but this was his last contracted assignment. His retirement papers processed yesterday morning. As of 0700 today, Flint is no longer active federal service. Senna looked down at the dog. Flint looked back at her with amber eyes that held the patient, deeply considering expression she had seen in every good working dog she had ever handled, the expression that was neither animal simplicity nor human complexity, but something that exists precisely between the two and that she had never found an adequate word for in all the years she'd been looking. "What happens to him now?" she asked. Rafe's answer was very quiet. "That depends on where he ends up." The federal convoy pulled out an hour later. The Aldgate flatbed under technical escort, 4 prisoners in separate vehicles, and a case file that would eventually run to 1,100 pages and result in federal racketeering indictments touching the Aldgate family's mineral extraction empire, asset forfeiture proceedings against Aldgate Mineral and Transport, and the full identification and disruption of the Owl Creek militia's procurement network across 3 western states. The high desert fuel and feed returned to being a truck stop on a state highway in Carbon County, Wyoming. When the last federal vehicle turned south onto 287, Senna stood in the emptying lot with Rafe and Flint. The snow were coming down more steadily now, dusting the gravel white, settling in Flint's fur and on the shoulders of Rafe's canvas jacket. "Your knuckles," Senna said. Rafe looked down at his right hand, split across 2 knuckles from the moment he had redirected Pickens's wrist as Flint completed the takedown. Clean, quick, the kind of joint lock disarm that looks effortless until you examine the hand afterward. "It's nothing," Rafe said. Senna reached into the emergency kit in her truck, the one she carried for field injuries both human and animal, and came back with antiseptic and gauze. She wrapped his hand without asking twice. "He's going to need somewhere quiet," she said, not looking up from the bandage. "Cold ground is hard on that calcaneus, and working dogs don't do well with sudden stillness. They need space to move." "I know," Rafe said. "I have 82 acres east of Muddy Creek," Senna said. "Old ranch property, quiet. The lower pasture has good soft ground." She tied off the bandage with one clean knot and looked up at him. "And the vet on site has been reading those ear tattoos her entire adult life." Rafe looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Flint. Flint was sitting between them in the snow, his scarred muzzle tilted slightly upward, sampling whatever the wind off the Wind River range was carrying that morning. His amber eyes were calm. His tail moved once, a single slow arc, against the white gravel. "He'd want to see the property first," Rafe said. "That's reasonable," Senna said. They stood there a moment longer in the cold, in the quiet that follows the end of something large and dangerous, while the snow came down and the highway stretched empty in both directions, and the dog between them breathed the clean Wyoming air with the unhurried steadiness of an animal who has finished his last hard day of work, and knows, in whatever way that knowledge lives in a creature that has spent its whole life in motion, that something entirely different is about to begin.